Welcome to Engaging Culture, a podcast presented by Bridgeway Christian Church. I'm Brian Kiley. Today, Pastor Lance Hahn and I welcome Greg Fuson to the program. Greg is the creator and curator of the Matter Gathering, a place for creatives to gather to wrestle with some of the biggest questions we face as humans. We'll talk to him today about the heart behind the conference and how we can create lives that matter. All of that and more on this episode of Engaging Culture. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 11 of the Engaging Culture podcast, joined by, well, first of all, I'm Brian Kiley, joined by middle-aged dad, Lance Hahn.
Yes, hello. I am middle-aged dad, talking for all middle-aged dads everywhere. Yes, which, by the way, off camera, right? I was just told I look like a middle-aged dad. I think I look awesome. I don't understand what the deal is.
What's wrong with being a middle-aged dad?
Well, it's awkward and insulting to me.
Well, that just sounds like a personal problem.
Let me process all of my insecurities right here on the air. That'd
wonderful.
be fantastic.
Well, our guest today is the one who pointed out Pastor Lance's middle-aged dadness, and that is Greg Fuson. Greg, thank you for pointing that out about Lance, and thank you more than that for being on our show. Glad to have you with us today.
My pleasure to be here. Fun fact, my wife and I were part of the pastoral search committee for a church that was just being launched many, many years ago that found and interviewed and hired Lance. So I will take credit for launching his career.
Wow.
Amen.
That sounds
Amen.
like, I think you just owe it all to Greg.
Greg was part of that by anyone taking notes, 1997.
1997.
Going back, that's a long time ago.
Wow. I didn't even realize that you guys went back that far.
Yes, we do. So I know Greg very well, and because depending on how he answers questions and whether or not he insults me at any point, I will dig up dirt and point out things about Greg and his wife, Joy. There we go. Okay,
I feel like we have like a mutually assured destruction thing
we do.
going on
Yes.
here, where if like
it's like the Cold War.
Somebody opens up, then it's just like... Well, I'm sure that would make for interesting listening for our listeners, but we will try to steer the conversation in a different direction if that's
Thank you, Brian.
If that's all right. You know, someone's got to be the adult.
Right.
It's my cross to bear. Anyway,
Okay.
Greg, talk to us a little bit about your background. You run this gathering called Matter Gathering, and we're going to get into talking about that. But how did this gathering come to be? Tell us a little bit about sort of your story and get into that point.
Yeah, so I'll try and give you the condensed version, but it's really like 20 plus years in the making. That's how long I've been doing conference organizing.
Wow.
It was a career it was a job that I fell into right out of college. I didn't think it was going to be a career, and pretty quickly I saw that, I really like this, and I'm kind of good at it. So I would say about 10 years into that process, things were going great. The event that I was working on was really successful. It was largely a case of being in the right place at the right time because it was fueled by a massive housing boom that didn't end until 2008. But at the time, we felt really successful, and we thought we were really smart. And it was about 10 years into it that I started to get this kind of gnawing sensation that as much success as we were having, that what I was pouring my time and energy into essentially amounted to helping our customers make more money and not get sued. And
that sounds very fulfilling.
Nothing wrong with that, right? I'm a capitalist, but at the same time, it was like, if there's not something more to this than that, then what's the point, really? I don't want to labor in vain.
Sure.
So that was what got me really kind of restless and began agitating for, can we be doing something that's deeper and more meaningful than this? And at the time, I was working with a group that was very focused on home building and community development. And as I started talking to other people about what might this look like, it became pretty clear that what was at the heart of everything that they do is community. And, not just community in the sense of the built environment, but the sort of the human fabric that's underneath it that gives it all meaning in the first place. And so, we sort of incubated this small kind of trial conference that we named The Vine to be a deep dive into the nature of community, and worked on that for the next 10 years, and ultimately came to a place where I, as sort of the creative driver of it, and they, as the organization that owned it and funded it, had different views on where they thought it should be going. And so we ultimately came to a decision that it didn't make sense to keep working on that together. But I knew that the spirit of that was something that I had to still pursue. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of the ending of that became the beginning of Matter.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to fill in some gaps here.
Okay.
Because I was with Greg during this entire process.
Okay.
So it starts out with he works for PCBC, Pacific Coast Building Conference. And what they do is they hold this, they used to, do they still do it?
They do.
Okay. So they hold this massive convention. Now, the one that I went to was at the Moscone Center in San Francisco, but I don't know if they always use that, but that they would need large spaces. Mm-hmm. So what that conference is actually all the different people that are involved in the building industry. So you have Pella windows and you have doors and you have all this stuff, and everyone comes and showcases their stuff.
Okay.
But while they're doing that, you have guest speakers coming in and they're firing up the group and they're excited. And so it's this big, like, if you are in the industry, you need to come from all over the nation and come to this conference. Well, Greg and his team put on the conference, and that was the job that he worked at.
Okay.
Then along the way, when we hit this idea where he starts talking to me about maybe there's something more and processing a lot, that's when the Vine started. So just filling in the gaps a little bit, the Vine was a subset of those same people that wanted to do something a little deeper than simply make money. Yeah. They wanted to get into the creative side of it. And as he said, that huge conference, really, as much as they're just building windows, they're ultimately building community. And so he started this thing called the Vine, and he invited me to it. Was I at the first one?
You were.
Was that Bacara?
Yes. Santa Barbara.
So Santa Barbara, you are familiar with Santa Barbara.
I'm familiar with Santa Barbara.
Bacara Resort out there.
Oh, cool.
Which, by the way, you started in style, brother. That's all I'm trying to tell you.
It's a nice place to start.
It's in Goleta, right? Mm-hmm. So on the edge of Santa Barbara. So I go to this thing and I'm like, what in the world are we doing? Like, I don't even know what's happening here. And all I knew was this is where Oprah goes. That's the one thing that I remember hearing about.
Well,
so
then you know it's legit.
It's legit. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
And so we go there. How many people were at the first Vine?
200.
Okay, so we have this 200 group subset of PCBC people that are saying, we trust Greg, we're into this idea of saying we want to do something more and build community and not just houses. And in that conference, just to give the listeners kind of a connection as to why I find this so fascinating, this is the first time I heard concepts like, hey, if you're going to build a city, and there were city planners there, and there always ends up being city planners somewhere around there, they go, we're trying to design a city that would actually work to infuse community. And this, I love this line. They said, when you're designing a city, you always ask yourself, if there's a mob with pitchforks, where would they amass, right? And it was the idea that you have to create a central location to what creates gathering and community and all this stuff. I start learning about what does a walkable community mean. I start learning about environmental architecture, all this stuff that I was like, I had no idea.
It's stuff that it's easy for us not to pay attention to, but these are things that professionals pay attention to, and it really affects the dynamics of cities and communities more than probably we realize. And it affects our individual lives more than we realize.
Yeah, and so being around that, and then not only just the people that do that, but the people that care about it. Like there's people that do things and there's people that care about stuff. Yeah. And you happen to amass about 200 people that said, I really want to think a bit deeper about it. Mm-hmm. So as you launched into that, sorry, Pastor Brian, I'm cutting you off right here. But as you launched into that first year, what were you hoping would happen through the Vine? Because we're going to get into Matter in a moment. But what were you hoping? We're there at Bacara. It's beautiful. Everything's set up. And it was an incredible event. But what were you thinking as you went in there?
Well, my objective in all of that was, and still is, to work with this particular audience that spends, I mean, look, there's no shortage of conferences out there, right? The world didn't need another seminar on, how to get better at XYZ.
Yes.
what I was looking to do was take this particular audience and bring them into a much bigger, broader, more significant conversation about what was important, what was essential about the things that they do.
Right.
And so from the get-go, my objective was always that I thought that the definition of success was that we are not just an industry group meeting and talking to each other about our own issues, right? Mm-hmm. That we are deliberately bringing in outsiders to expand our perspective, to provoke us to a different way of thinking, to even make us a little bit uncomfortable.
Yes.
That was a key element. A little bit of, the right amount of disequilibrium is good for people.
Yeah, and it wasn't simply that you were only talking about building issues. So, for example, give a couple, in those early years of the Vine, what were some of the speakers that you had come in? Because I remember a couple that really stuck out to me. But to you, like, what kind of speakers would you bring in? You were stirring the pot and getting people to think. Mm-hmm. So who were those people? Do you remember?
Well, so I'm curious, once you throw at me the ones that stuck out with you.
Okay, I was a huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell, right? So the guy,
awesome.
I mean, so when you're talking about some heavy hitters, that guy, his books, Blink and The Tipping Point and stuff like that, yep. I had kind of already been in those. Yep. And so when this, kind of awkward white guy with a fro shows up and I realized that's Malcolm Gladwell. Because I think I first saw him at PCBC, and then you ended up importing him into the Vine. But he came in and spoke. I remember that there was some that would talk about artwork. There was a lot of artwork pieces. There was a lot of creativity and artistry, and I'm blending a lot of them into the Matter speakers as well. So I'm not quite sure if we're going to talk about. But what do you remember? Who you brought in?
Well, the one I thought you were going to say was Erwin McManus.
Oh yeah, well yes, one of my fellow brothers in the ministry.
Yes.
So that was and this gets into probably the deeper, more personal, and probably more relevant to this listener group aspect to it, right, is that I'm a believer.
Yes.
I have my entire career worked in the secular field.
Yes.
This is a secular audience. This is a business-specific event.
Yes.
But I'm coming at this as the organizer, as the creator, as the curator, with a faith-based perspective.
Yeah, how does Jesus not leak into that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, that was important to me. Not that I was going to, I wasn't trying to surreptitiously sneak faith into this. My objective all along was to take a secular audience and bring them right up alongside issues that are deeply, innately, profoundly from and of God.
Yeah.
And that if those two worlds rubbed against each other, that something good would come from that. And that was basically my whole approach. Erwin McManus was a speaker that I knew that I could bring in who had a clearly defined faith point of view, but also a very sensitive heart to culture and what's going on in the world. And I kind of figured I can trust this guy, to share issues of faith in a way that's going to be very sensitive to and respectful of a non-faith audience.
Yeah, and absolutely he did.
Yeah. He's someone who, I don't know him personally or anything, but I've watched his career, and he's somebody who has, like you said, a clear faith perspective, tremendous cultural savvy, and can be very sort of disarming in his approach that I could see a faith-based and secular audience sort of nodding along and being motivated by him and a lot of what he has to say. Yeah. And I think that, he in my mind, he's sort of a great picture of sort of what it sounds like you're trying to accomplish through the conference is you're just bringing about people who can speak to the human heart, who can speak to these issues of real life, speak to these challenges that people from across the board, secular, faith-based, whatever, are facing, and you start to and I think the beauty of our faith is that when it's presented appropriately, our faith can speak into these questions and can do so winsomely and effectively, and some cool things can happen. Now, you were with Vine for a while, and then you started Matter. And like you said, the world did not need another conference. Nobody's saying if only we had a conference to go to, right? But you and I have talked a little bit about how is the Matter gathering different than sort of your standard. I've been to a million conferences and nearly all of them have been great. You know, how is Matter different than your standard conference?
Yeah, so let's start with the word conference. I mean, it's a shorthand that we use to understand, a group of people coming together and being in a defined space for a defined length of time, right?
Yep. Right.
That's about where the label ends when it comes to what it is that we're trying to create, first with the vine and now with Matter. Let's start with the environment. I don't meet in hotel ballrooms or convention centers.
Right.
Not a slam against them, but they're pretty sterile environments, and they are very, very expected when it comes to people showing up for these things. And so when you put them into a familiar space that they've been in dozens of times before, they're just going to sort of slip into this default behavior, right?
Yeah,
they're going to be in conference mode, and I don't want people in conference mode. I want them there in a way that is much more receptive to new ideas and new ways of looking at the world, and open themselves to share and be vulnerable and be themselves, so that the interactions that people are having amongst themselves are that much more meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think that you trigger that through a number of ways, but for starters, you get them out of the expected environment.
Right. So, I mean, you talk about being in sort of conference mode. To me, conference mode's a little bit passive, right? Like if I'm an attendee at a conference, I might make some connections or have some small talk or meet someone who does something similar at a different church or whatever. But I'm sitting, I'm listening, I'm not participating. I get the sense that Matter is a much more participatory environment. Would that be fair to say?
That's the goal. And, without getting too kind of sort of conference wonky on you, a lot of groups are going to the unconference, which, kind of defined as there's no planned agenda and the whole thing is kind of wide open and it's participant led. I'll incorporate some of that, but no, that's not what this is about. I mean, for thousands,
there's still a plan here.
Exactly. Yeah. You want some organization to it, and for thousands of years, we've been learning at the feet of people with wise things to teach us, right? So I'm not trying to get away from that. I do still have a lineup of speakers. It's just that, I approach conference design, putting together a program, as a lot like filmmaking, right? There needs to be an emotional arc from start to finish. Yeah. I always want to touch on multiple experiential feelings that you're going to have. I want you to laugh. I want you to cry. I want you to be provoked. I want you to feel uncomfortable for part of the time. And that's really driven by the idea that, as Hugh MacLeod has put it, nothing changes until someone feels something first, right? So you want to activate the person's emotions to get them into a more kind of receptive frame of mind to hear new ideas and think about the world in different ways.
Yeah. Let me give the audience kind of an idea on what the experience is like. So this last one, you come into these rather creative environments. So the last place that we had Matter at was down in LA, and talk a little bit about what the venue was.
Yeah, so the building was a former church that had been a community hub in in Highland Park, LA, for over 100 years. In the earlier part of the while it was still a functioning church, it was very socially progressive. It was a big driver and supporter of the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. Eventually, sort of fell into decline and closed as a church. And it was then acquired and renovated by a husband and wife team, a musician team, with just a beautiful eye for creating lovely, engaging, inviting spaces. And so this was a rundown church that was beautifully restored. They kept all of the stained glass windows intact.
It's crazy cool.
and you just walk into it and you feel something, right?
Wow.
And furthermore, so it's a cool space to begin with. It's usually used for weddings,
Okay.
and that's one thing I found is that wedding venues tend to know how to play
Yes.
up the emotion.
Yeah.
So I'll look for those. And again, it's this. I'm at a conference, but this looks nothing like what I'm used to when I come to a conference.
Yeah, like, so I pull up in this neighborhood because it's in a neighborhood now.
Yep.
It's all been built up around it. It was a neighborhood church. So I pull up. They have valet out front. You walk in. There's seats where, look, you're seeing stained glass windows. Out back is this beautiful patio where we ended up eating. There's live music playing. And it's what I love, there's all these different chairs and there's this artwork everywhere. So he sets up artwork on the walls so that everything is visually captivating. And then, so you have all your senses being hit when you walk in. And then everyone's milling around. Not everybody knows each other, but now after a couple years, people are starting to get to know each other. So there's kind of a friendly vibe to it. There's drinks being served, and then there's M&M things everywhere where you can kind of scoop out M&Ms. I was like, this is awesome. I love this place. And there was little things to do throughout the conference. The next morning, they had all these really creative donuts that were out on the table and for people to eat. And it was like everything was intentional. So I don't know if you've ever been to like the coolest conference in the world, but it's kind of that kind of.
Got it. Okay,
You got
there
it?
we go.
Yeah.
Now I got the picture.
Yes. So when you have like, anyway, when you have speakers that are coming in, and one of them is just doing a documentary film on the spirit of a city, like L.A., just going around and looking at the soul of a city. When you're talking about this guy that teaches hip hop to kids, and he has them build architecture through Legos, and he largely goes into the inner city and teaches young kids with music and Legos how to build community. I mean, it's just, there's so many vastly creative, like challenging, and well, how do you do this multi-use space, and how do you handle this while at the same time, this woman had dealt with cancer, and she's trying to write books and letters and cards to people that have cancer, and all these things are pulling at your emotions and your mind. That's the conference.
So it's a really broad mix of presenters and worldviews and ideas. Mm-hmm. Sounds like that's probably an understatement right there.
and intentionally.
Intentionally.
So,
So your tagline for Matter, a gathering of people who make places. Mm-hmm. I love that expression, but what does it mean?
No, it's in some ways deliberately vague. And I don't mean that to be sort of cute and coy. I mean, when I started Matter, and look, this was my venture. It's just me. I mean, I have a team of people that work with me, right? But there isn't a corporate backer. This is me, right? Yeah. So, basically, I needed a group of people who would trust me enough to show up when I said, hey, I'm doing a new thing. Will you take a flyer on it?
Yeah.
And so my relationships were really rooted in the development community. And so those were the people who primarily were the ones to say, yeah, I'll come take a chance on this new thing. Mm-hmm. I would say the common denominator that most of the people in the room share is that they either work in community development or they work in fields that are sort of, development adjacent. And by that, I mean public art, public planning. And my perspective on this was it was never going to be a conference about real estate development. It was never even going to be about, the planning of cities and artful placemaking. Those are wonderful things, and the people in the room do a lot of them, but that's not what this focus was going to be. That it was going to be this broader, richer mix of people. Mm-hmm. And together, the things that they do, the passion that they bring to their work, results in better, more vibrant, more lively, more livable places.
Yeah, it's almost the collective passion of the group.
Yeah.
Inspires people in their own sort of individual ways.
Yes.
And kind of the gathering itself is a jumping off point for us to really talk about some of the values that you place behind Matter and all of that. And we're going to get into that in just a second. I'm curious to hear from you, Lance. You had the opportunity to attend this last year. Being in an environment that was different than a lot of environments that you're typically in. And frankly, for most people there, I'm guessing it was a little different than the environment they're typically in.
Right.
But being around that collective passion, being around that diversity of gifting and perspective, how were you moved by that experience?
Yeah, for me, it was, so I thrive in creative environments. I thrive in idea bombardment. So to me, it was awesome. It was very uncomfortable personally because I was not the coolest dude in the room. Meaning, once again, I stuck out. Yet at the same time, I was absorbing all these ideas. I love the idea of raw data. I love the idea of something completely out of left field coming in and making me think. And I felt like, let's take it back to being more personal here in Sacramento. So down in our waterfront here in Sacramento, there's always been a desire to do some renovation. When we had the Golden One Center come in, that changed K Street, right? All of a sudden property values changed. And when they keep talking about we could have a killer, amazing waterfront, right? So you have Joe's Crab Shack and you have the Rio City Cafe. And they're like, if we could renovate all this, because right now it's kind of, it's hit and miss, right? Well, they always have been talking for decades about how to make Sacramento cool. Well, the people that are behind the scenes that are trying to figure out where do we get the money from, how do we put it in, and what would we design to make our city come alive, those are the types of people that are in this room, right? This is what he's feeding into, because you would say, now you could either have a bunch of corporate people walk in and just go, well, we can make it built for money, or you can stir them in this pod. And all of a sudden, when they start shaping the waterfront of Sacramento, they're thinking lives being impacted. They're thinking of health. They're thinking about how are the poor at least acknowledged. They're worried about the environmental impact. They're worried about, you know what I'm saying? Like you have all these power players being mixed together. So for me, it was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Huh. Wow.
But out of my element.
Sure, yeah. But I mean, I'm guessing that's sort of part of the point is I mean, you even referenced this a minute ago, Greg, just the idea that you kind of want it to be a little bit of an uncomfortable environment, enough so that it's a little bit provocative for folks that come in. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, the right measure of that is a good thing.
Yeah, too much and we start to shut down or get defensive or whatever, but not enough and it becomes just another conference. Right.
So I want to hear a little bit, Greg, can you... everything that I'm saying as a participant, how much of that is what you really wanted? How much of that is, well, that wasn't quite what I was going for? Or when you start talking about this idea that the Lord has really put you in this place for such a time as this, you have the ability to impact your world. I mean, we're engaging culture, right? That's the whole point of the podcast. You have an ability to engage culture in ways that I cannot.
Yeah.
All those people are not coming to my church. All those people aren't listening to my podcast, but they're coming to your event. As a matter of fact, this is an invitation-only event, and it's very high ticket.
Right.
So you have people paying significant money to be impacted and affected by something you're designing. Is what I'm experiencing what you're hoping they're experiencing? Like, react off kind of the stuff that you're hearing me say. Does that make you feel good? Or, wow, dude, that's not at all what I meant to do.
Well, a lot of what you're describing and what I think shaped your experience is that this is very much a secular audience.
Yes.
And you walked in there and it's not like you were wearing a badge that said, hey, I'm a Christian and I give sermons every weekend. But I think you walked in feeling like an outsider to that audience because it is very much, by definition,
yes,
this is a secular activity.
Absolutely. No, I think that's good. But as far as the experience of someone coming in and being mixed up with a bunch of ideas, and is that really the hope of shaping tomorrow kind of through these people? Is that kind of really what you're going for?
Yeah, so there is nothing about the program that is going to be sort of this nuts and bolts, how to get better at this particular thing, right? You're not going to come in there and be a better social media marketer because of something that you heard from this.
Right.
It is going to, I hope, really help you think about why you're doing what you're doing and how other people have navigated similar challenges and what you might take away from that in the sense of, how do I look at the world? How do I look at myself in it?
Yeah.
Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Well, and it's almost like those are baseline issues that they're not measurable skills necessarily.
Right.
But when we're healthy in those ways, it transforms all our measurable skills, right? I'm curious to know, now you're coming up on year 3, right? How have you personally been impacted by the Matter experience, or what have you learned from the kind of the community of people that you've gathered for the event?
Yeah, it's been extraordinary. The people that I have met and gotten to know have had a dramatic impact on my life. I'll share one particular story where this is kind of me in a dual role, because I'm the organizer of the program and I'm the one who put all of this together, but I'm also, as it's playing out, sitting in the audience and receiving it just like everyone else is. So we had a speaker a couple of years back who talked about what she described, and she's wonderful at wordplay. She described as this concept of the cantalist.
The cantalist.
So she talks about how in creative endeavors and in creating great things to put out into the world, there's a lot of focus on the word can, right? We tend to be very kind of like, it's like a forward, positive, optimistic way of looking at it.
Sure.
Her perspective on this was that there's a lot that we can learn from flipping that perspective and looking at can't, and specifically looking at the things that you can't not do.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay.
So her whole point on this was that if you pay attention to the things that you can't not do, right, you cannot resist them when the opportunities come up. Those are the things that you are deeply drawn to, and there's a reason for that. And if you find those things, and if you can sort of put them at the center of what you're doing, then everything that you do is going to be fueled by it and is going to be better as a result of that. So I'm listening to this.
Powerful.
And again, I'm the organizer. I'm the one who brought her in as a speaker. I knew more or less what she was going to say. I wasn't expecting to be hit in a particular way. But as she's describing this, I'm thinking about our daughter. And she is wonderfully creative. She has this fantastic imagination. And she can be as flighty as you could imagine a creative, artistic soul to be. And we had been wrestling with, so as parents, sort of this question of how much do you feed these creative opportunities versus how much do you try to also impose some structure? And when I thought about her approach to the world from the standpoint of she's being drawn to the things that she can't not do. She's not a willfully disobedient child, right? She's drawn to this because it's wired into her. It changed my entire approach to parenting and how I looked at ways to give her more opportunities to do that, right? And we still had to address like the, you got to clean up your room once in a while sort of thing. But that's like a fundamental shift, and it helped me see it in a way that I had never seen it before.
Yeah. Huh. Wow. That's interesting.
Just you talking about that immediately goes, what can't I not do? That's ministry.
Yeah.
All my life I've been involved in ministry. Paul talks about if I stop doing the gospel, the rocks will cry out. Like there's this compulsion going on. It's not something, it's not on the table for me to say, nope, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I always have to do that. And it's going to leak out of me even when I try not to. So yeah, that's interesting.
And I love that perspective though, because I think, like you're saying, Lance, you found in what you do, like this is just how it's got to be, there's something in you that is going to feel some angst or some dissatisfaction if you're not doing ministry. And I think that too many of us go through our lives sort of settling for, well, this is just what I'm going to do. And on some level, not everybody gets to have a job that they're passionate about. We're all very fortunate to get to do that. There are practical things. We got to pay our bills, things like that, right? But I think to even if we're just talking hobbies or ways that we spend our time, to even ask that question of, okay, what really makes me come alive? What do I feel there's something missing if it's not present? Man, I'm sure you'd agree with this, Greg. I think that if more of us leaned into that, I think the world would be a very different place. But it's just so easy in the midst of stress and the day-to-day and challenges and parenting and trying to get enough sleep and all of that. It's easy to lose. But I love that perspective of even saying, I mean, it's something that my wife and I talk about in terms of, I mean, we're both fortunate to be, similar to what Lance said, very passionate about our careers, but even just saying, okay, outside of that, like, what can you do when you're not looking at the clock?
Right.
What can you do when you're like, oh man, it's already been an hour. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
I think there's something very human about leaning into that.
Yeah. So I was once asked by someone in a very much kind of a business MBA sort of sense to define my objectives for why I was doing this. Like, what was I hoping for the outcome? So I thought, okay, well, I got to think about this. And I thought I was going to put together like a bulleted list for him. And really when I sat down with it and kind of looked inside my own heart and what am I hoping to come out of this, three things emerged for me, right? The first is, and we touched on this quite a bit. I want everyone sitting in the room to feel something.
Yeah.
Right? I want their emotions to be activated. Second point is I want them to be changed by something that they felt. And the third thing is I want them to go out and share it with other people.
Yeah.
So there it is. I want you to feel something. I want you to change something as a result of it. I want you to share it with others. No business analyst wants to hear that, right, as your business plan, but that's it. That's success for me.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you're like on some level, it's like, well, and what else?
Right.
But on a different level, if you accomplish that, I mean, that's transformational.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. So you wrote this. Now, correct me. You have this credo.
Yes.
Is it out in final draft form, or is it still is it still a work in progress?
I think it's in finished form now, and we're in the process of formatting it and turning it into a small booklet.
Okay. So what I was hoping to do for the remaining part of the episode is there was you sent us this credo, and there's a big part of it that really resonated with me. I mean, a lot of it did, but in particular, just this one section. I want to read it, and then I just want to the three of us discuss some of the issues that get brought up by it, because I think they're fascinating, and probably any one of these 5 or 6 issues we could quite easily fill an hour talking about. But you say this, you write, or did you write this, or did someone else?
I did.
I don't want to give you all the credit if it's,
I wrote it, yes.
Okay, very good. You wrote, "We believe that meaningful work is hard but essential. Difference is interesting and valuable. In a time when things are becoming faster and shallower, there's tremendous value in slower and deeper. 97% of the time, the book is better than the movie. 99% of the time, the original is better than the sequel. We are not our worst failures. We are not our greatest successes. We're meant to exist in community. When we don't feel alone, it's easier to be our unique, quirky, true selves. The point of life isn't to feel more comfortable, it's to feel more alive." That's good stuff right there.
Thank you.
That's good stuff. Okay.
Wow.
Lance is impressed. Okay, so Lance, here, I'm going to put you on the spot right here.
Yes.
Of what we just read, I've got a bunch of questions here that we could go through, and we will. I'm just curious to know what of that we just read resonates most deeply with you.
The idea that there's something that is God designed inside of us that when we connect into it, something gets engaged and comes alive. That's the first thing that comes through in my mind.
Awesome. Very
Yep.
good. Love it.
What about you, Pastor
what about
Brian?
Me? I mean, man, I don't know. So much of it. You know what? I'm just going to have it be a lead into the first thing I want to talk about. Meaningful work is hard but essential. I feel like I've given myself some version of that speech for a very long time. I feel like my wife and I have given each other versions of that speech as we've gotten discouraged by just the reality that meaningful work is hard. Why is it important to you that we recognize that meaningful work, inherent in meaningful work, is difficulty, and what is lost if we miss that?
Right. So I find that the longer I do this work, the more autobiographical it becomes. Right? So, whether that's selfish or whether that's, taking my own experience and helping other people learn from it, or a mixture of both. So here's a little backstory. When I made the decision to start Matter and to go into business for myself, and by the way, I'm not an entrepreneurial guy. I have no startup experience before. I've gotten a lot of bumps and bruises along the way. I thought this was sort of the culmination of all that I had done, and this was going to be living the dream, right? So I have all of this, experience, and now I'm going to take it and I'm going to turn it into my thing, and I get to be the one who calls all the shots, and I have total creative control. I thought it was ultimate, and the thing that I find is that the experience, and it's been wonderful, right? It's a fantastic thing to do. I'm so glad that I'm doing it. But what surprised me is that it didn't surprise me that it's fulfilling up to 100. It surprised me that it is taxing up to 99, and sometimes those two trade places.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of different reasons, and we can get into that. But what I felt very early on was that we were going to be missing something. It would be unfair to people to come at this as though, follow your passion and everything will be great.
Right.
This was never going to be sort of a puppies and unicorns sort of thing, where, I wanted us to face head on the realities of what it means to do something that you pour your heart and soul into, that you open yourself up and make yourself vulnerable at times, that you do something, if you want to create something that people are going to love, you have to be willing to create something that some people will hate. You have to be willing to polarize and be okay with that. And, sort of as the artist, as the creative, as anyone who's trying to put something out into the world that means something deeply to them, your feelings, your emotions, your identity are going to be tied up in it. Yeah. And when it doesn't go well, it's hard not to take that personally. So I just wanted to look at this all with a very honest lens and say, hey, this is great stuff and you should be doing it, but don't expect it to be easy.
Yeah. It's going to cost you something.
Right.
It's going to, well, and I think we live in a world where we have such incredible access to finished products, right? We can see, somebody, it's a cliche now, but nobody posts the picture of them getting out of bed at 5 a.m. to go to the gym. They just post here's me before and here's me having lost 50 pounds. Like, we don't see the struggle. Right? We don't see the struggle of the creative process. We see the book. We see the sermon. We see whatever. It's funny. I was having coffee with a good buddy of mine the other day, and he was asking about my process here's what he was asking. He was asking, man, are you just wiped out after the weekend? After a week, if I preach, which is, just a handful of times a year. And whenever people ask me that, I always tell them, actually, no, I'm very energized by the preaching process. So I go home and I'm great. We'll go to the pool. We'll ride bikes. We'll play with my kids, do whatever. I'm good. I say it's Saturday at 3:30. Then I'm like, just find me a hole I can crawl into and just, right? Or I talk about how going through, and I don't know what your week is like, Lance. You obviously do this a lot more than me. But I talked about how I've just learned to trust the process of, on a preaching week, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm just going to feel terrible about myself. Like, I'm just like, this is it. This is the week. I'll have nothing to say. I will be exposed as a fraud, and it's over. Right? Just sort of, and
this
then,
is the end of my life.
Exactly. And then it's, Thursday, Friday, I pick myself up off the ground and I write the sermon, and then people see the weekend like, oh, well, that was nice, right? Yes. And it's like, oh man, there's so much behind it. But I've learned to trust that process, and I'm sure, hopefully your process is a little gentler than that, Lance, but I'm sure you can relate to that on some level.
Totally.
But you learn to trust the process to say, okay, I'm going to get through. I need to just push through the challenge. I need to push through the sense of, the pressure of, oh gosh, what's going to happen, God, what's, help, I need to just push through that and trust that God will meet me in that and something good will come out of it. But it's hard. But it's so hard. And I think that too often when we fixate on finished products, because again, that's what we see. Nobody's sitting and watching, me stare at my blank computer screen going, okay, here we go. Right. Yep. But when we fixate on the finished process finished product without appreciation for how hard the process is, when we're faced with our own hard process, it can get pretty discouraging. Right?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think the very idea of meaningful is kind of where the Christian world and the secular world can meet together. I think that one thing that's so beautiful about what you do and what matters about is the idea that I feel like this is where the church has strength. This is where the church has traction. Because if you're going to talk about matter, you're going to talk about purpose.
Yeah.
If you're going to talk about purpose, you have to talk about design. If you're going to talk about design, you have to talk about God. Yeah. And like instead of chasing all the way up the chain, you can stop at the links that are a little bit lower and have this deep interaction that if the Lord then draws them up the chain, that's up between them. You know what I mean? But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about meaning. We're going to talk about value. We're going to talk about matter. We're going to talk about transformation. We're going to talk about, and that's where there's all this overlap. And I feel like you're in that sweet spot, which I think for our listeners, the idea that you would say, where in your life do you have an intersection with the world where you can play, where you can talk, where you can engage? Because once again, if you stay in that area, the Lord has access to draw them one direction. Obviously, the enemy has a chance to draw them in another direction. But you're not in a place of conflict. You're in a place of confluence. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And that's a beautiful, like, if we're going to talk about engaging culture, that's a sweet spot. It's right there. Because if you stepped in and started having, it was constant preachers coming in and talking, it changes the conference. It ruins it. And so what you do is you continue to have elements of God existing in other places through some people that may not acknowledge him at all as God. But he's still anointed them. There's still stuff going through them, So anyway, I not necessarily, jumping off your side of things, but you don't want, knowing you, Greg, the idea is, you were saying earlier, you had three things that you really wanted. You wanted people to feel something, change because of it, and tell others about it. You could say, well, that could be at a murderer's convention. Hey, I felt something. I'm going to kill better, and I'm going to tell all my serial killer friends about it. That obviously the point is behind those things, it's why you put it in your credo right off the bat. It's meaningful. Like, we're not just doing anything. Yeah. We're doing something meaningful, and underlying that is power. Yeah. So anyway,
absolutely.
So I read somewhere that psychologists believe that there are two universal desires that we all share. Right. So the first one is to know that someone cares when we're hurting, and the second one is to believe that in the end things are going to be okay. Right. If we all want that universally, what that tells me is we all want a loving and caring God. We just call him by different names. And some people are uncomfortable with the God of the Bible, and so they're seeking it in other forms. But at the end of the day, who doesn't want that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's, what you have described is what God offers to us, and you're right that various people for various reasons have levels of discomfort or whatever the case may be, but I think you talk about intersections, Lance, and I love that terminology is very helpful to me. Intersecting kind of our passion, our needs, our desires with sort of the needs of the world. If those truly are universal needs, and I have no reason to doubt that they are, our faith speaks into that so beautifully. And I think it's tremendous to be able to think about that in terms of how do we even talk about our faith? How do we engage culture with a Christian perspective? It's that we're able to speak to these issues of there is someone who cares, and things are going to turn out, okay at the end, which is beautiful to me. Now, I want to ask you about another element of the credo, because this is something I'm contemplating quite a lot in my own life. Is you say that in a time when things are becoming faster and shallower, there's tremendous value in slower and deeper. I feel like we're in the midst of this sort of funny culture, like the beginning of maybe a bit of a cultural backlash right now, where the speed of things has increased so much that now there is starting to be this swing the other direction. Sort of mindfulness activities are very popular right now. There are all these, I keep hearing about books talking about, getting rid of hurry and slowing down and everything else. It's like we've sort of realized, okay, maybe we're spinning the wheels a little fast here, and we ought to pull it back. How have you seen in the community that you engage with specifically through the Matter Conference or the Matter Gathering, excuse me, how do you see the benefit of this sort of slower, deeper approach to life that you're advocating in the Credo?
Well, there's a bit of a paradox here because, and this is true of me, and I know this to be true of many of the people who attend and are part of this and value it and spend time and money to be there. I think just about everyone in the room would raise their hand and say, yes, I agree with that. And that's something that I want to make a priority in my life. And yet in the day-to-day, just rush of life, and especially in career. I mean, the people who are there are successful. Sure. They are generally, senior executives within their organization. These are people who wouldn't have gotten where they did if they didn't have a lot of drive in them. Right. And and one of the things I came to understand is that for most of them, something like Matter is one of the rare times over the course of a year when they will actually take the time out of their schedule to be filled up by something like this. So people have told me, I walk into the room, I'm completely on empty, and this fills me up in a way that I need so I can be recharged and go back and give what I need to my company and my friends and my family. Yeah. Which is, I love to hear that. I'm glad that we're able to provide that, but it's also kind of a stark reminder of, the pace of life that we lead doesn't leave a lot of room for that.
Right. So then how do we, I think that raises a question, and I'm not going to suggest that any one of us are experts in what I'm about to ask, but how do we do that? How do we cultivate some depth and some slowness in a world that is moving so fast? I think that I feel that tension personally. I see that tension around me. Mm-hmm. How do we start to do that? Or is that why you have the conference? So someone else will tell us how.
So here's the affirmation part of it. I think it's really important to bring in people who kind of have the crash and burn experience. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of this we learn through cautionary tale. Yep. But at least we can learn from it, right? So, I think there's tremendous value in hearing from one another, our stories, sort of the hard lessons learned. And so that's a big part of, what you will hear from the speakers on the stage, but also just from the people that you're talking to in the room is, we have these shared values. We want this. We're all up against the same reality. So what's worked for you?
Yeah.
I'll throw out, you talked about there's a lot of books out there and a lot of talk about it. I'll throw out one thing that's been particularly on my mind recently. And this is a little bit of a tip to a speaker that I'm hoping to bring to Matter. But there's a book called How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell.
It's funny.
And, sort of counter to what the title suggests, it's not necessarily, like go do a silent meditation for a week. What she's really talking, so she's talking about regaining kind of space and time and perspective in your life. But what's so fascinating to me is she's looking deeper into kind of the fundamental implication of what it means that we now live in a world and we are complicit in letting our time and our attention become this commodity that the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Twitters of the world and Instagram can capture and monetize, and we're okay with that. That's a little bit chilling when you think about it. And so she's got a kind of a really deep perspective on what it says about us if we are willing to kind of just go along with that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and obviously the forces behind that are very smart and know how to tap into our psyches in various ways. And I don't mean to say that in like a fear-mongery sort of way, but it's just a reality. And it is, to be able to detach from that is not natural. Like natural is just, we're part of this new system now, and this is our role in it, and the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the Amazons of the world now have this unprecedented access to us, and how do we step away from it, and that becomes a challenge.
Right. And I think that's so it's kind of a roundabout way of getting back to the question that you asked is I want to suggest that, and believe me, I need this as much as anyone. I want to suggest that if we kind of reevaluate what we're allowing to define our identity, we're already on the right path toward kind of getting our time and our activities and our priorities aligned with. And you know, in this case, we're talking about God, the Creator, who loves us and wants only the best for us.
Yeah. From a faith perspective, yes, realigning our identity is clear and is the forefront. I mean, we talk about that all the time here at Bridgeway. I mean, and for good reason, because that is the foundation of so much. And when we're unclear about our identity, or I would argue we're not intentional about identity formation, it gets formed kind of for us, which is never as healthy. So, last question, and then we'll get out of here.
Yep. Hold on one second.
Hold on.
I got to throw something in here real quick. One of the things that Greg tries to do through this conference is bring in thought leaders, and what that means is that you have a lot of people that are early adopters that you're hoping to get in the room, and they start leading into that. When you said, "What do you do about all this fast-paced stuff?" The first time I was ever introduced to the slow movement was at the Vine. So we were down. I think we were in Santa Barbara, and we had a slow dinner. And that was the first time where you go, well, what's a slow dinner? It was the idea that you draw it out for a really long time, and there's meaningful pieces all the way along. So we started the evening and had the chef come out and talk about where all the ingredients were from, where they were harvested, what was used, how it was all made. And then you had kind of a talk, and then there was drinks time, and then it was stretching it out. And so it was actually at this conference that I began to be introduced to ideas of slowing down. And that now, that was way back when. I don't even remember what year that was.
That was 2006. So this was like an early adopter thing at that time. It's a lot more commonplace now.
Right. So that's what I'm saying is back then it was all new and edgy because a lot of those people that were the early adopters and the early thought producers were already burned out. So they were saying, listen, this is what we are engaging with, and there was a big movement in Europe and all that stuff. So this is what we're engaging with. We're going to bring it back. Well, now that stuff is trickling in and becoming a bit more mainstream, right? But back in 2006, it was a little bit new. And so I would just say that one of the things that is necessary for transformation is reflection.
Yep.
And now, if you have too much reflection, you have no movement. If you have no reflection, you have no movement. So it is the proper amount of reflection drives transformation. So anyway, that was it. I just wanted to say that. Throwing it back to you.
Amen. Well said. So here's my last question, and there's so many other things from the manifesto or the credo we could manifesto, credo, whatever. Anyways, that we could get into, but I just thought we had a quick conversation here about these last couple lines. The point of life isn't to feel more comfortable; it's to feel more alive. What's the difference between those two things? And then how do we get away from? Why are we so obsessed with comfort? And how do we get to something more meaningful than that?
Right. So, quick sidebar. This started out as a manifesto. And someone told me it was a little bit too Unabomber-esque.
Yes.
That's all I think of.
The Communist Manifesto.
Yes, great.
Not a lot of like things we think highly of are called manifestos these days.
Right.
So my
Peace
bad.
Manifesto.
Credo.
Go.
Okay, I'm sorry. What was the question?
What are we even talking about? I don't know. Comfort versus feeling more alive.
Oh, yeah.
What's the difference? Why are we so driven to comfort, and how can we pursue something greater?
Oh, okay. There's a lot here. All right, I'm going to tell a quick story about what framed this perspective for me the first time. And this was from a woman named Dee Williams, who was an early pioneer in the tiny house movement. And she wrote a memoir about her own experience of kind of life transformation from career path and 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and she ultimately built an 84 square foot home that she now lives in, and kind of just, massive life reconfiguration. And she lives up in Washington, And this tiny house has no heating and no air conditioning. And so it gets hot in the summer and it gets cold in the winter. And she shared a story about, and she had a little space heater. And then at some point became aware of the fact that she was enclosed in a structure made entirely of wood with an unreliable heater.
Yes.
And it just made her a little bit too edgy. So she got rid of the space heater.
Can't imagine why.
Her process for enduring the cold winter nights is she would get up into her loft bed space. She would huddle under a big pile of blankets, and then she would get her dog up there with her, and the dog would sort of curl up, and the two of them would create this little pocket of warmth. So here's the takeaway. She writes in her memoir that although it never got, like warm and this was not like she was under down comforters or anything.
Right.
But her point was, I was warm enough in the same way that I was happy enough, which is to say, the good and the bad are part of what shaped my experience. And I'm not trying for
euphoria.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, so I'm not advocating that we all live as monks and deprive ourselves at every turn. But yeah, there is something a little bit sinister in believing that comfort is the point of everything, and then you've kind of created this sheltered life for yourself.
Yeah.
And a lot of for me, my own personal experience and what shaped that perspective and why it made it into the credo is that I began to see that the times in my life when I was the most comfortable and I had the least amount of conflict and the least amount of turmoil, I was also the least satisfied with what I was doing and the work that I was putting out into the world.
Interesting.
And that if I wasn't taking chances, like if I wasn't having ups and downs,
Sure.
it meant that I wasn't taking chances. If I wasn't taking chances, I wasn't stretching myself and I wasn't doing the work that I was most pleased with.
Yeah. It's almost like if as a creative or as somebody who desires to really put something out into the world that is useful and beneficial, if there's no tension, there's sort of almost no fun.
Right.
You kind of have to have that sense of, okay, this is hard, this is difficult, I don't know if this is going to work, I've got critics, I've got this and that going on.
Yeah.
Like there's something that kind of makes you feel alive in that.
It's
right?
the rule of literature.
Yeah.
All stories have to have tension or
Yes.
they're not stories.
Right. It's a boring story. Lance, we talk about, you use the phrase to describe yourself as an agitating peacemaker, right?
Yes.
Someone who's willing to shake things up to settle things down.
Yes.
And I think I thought of you as I was reading this and sort of this contrast between comfort and aliveness necessarily. Looking at it specifically through the lens of our faith, looking at it through the lens of a pastor, how do you go about, A, just for yourself, and then B, even as a leader of others, trying to point us towards being more alive as opposed to simply settling for comfort?
Well, and that's the thing. I think that we were built to where, there's a lot of different seasons in life, but some of those seasons of life in Christianity ought to be exhilarating. And I think that the exhilaration comes from tension. It comes from stretching. It comes from, oh my gosh, I have muscles that I've been building and I thought it was just hard and now I'm stronger. And I think it's discovery, but discovery demands ignorance. And you know what I mean? It's like, so to me, everything that Jesus did was that whole tension piece that they would come in close and he'd keep drawing them in and then he'd push them back and then they'd come back in and then he'd challenge them and then so I felt like he was that agitating peacemaker guy that I'm trying to chase after and be like him, and so for me, I think everything we're talking about is so rich and so good, and this is why I was excited about this conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, to your point, Greg, you're saying it's not about needless deprivation, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying the comforts of the lives we've been given, of just the modern conveniences we have. I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying those things, but when we make our chief end comfort, I don't think that's ever going to activate everything in us that God wants to activate.
Yeah.
And the greatest change agents in the world today are not people who are sitting around trying to maximize their comfort. And I would even go so far as to say the happiest people in the world are not people trying to maximize
I think there's a great myth around risk, which says that it's risky to go out on a limb and it's safe to stay in, close in a comfortable spot. And I would argue there's risk in both of them. It's just a different kind of risk.
Yeah. Sort of reminds me of the old, they talk about like consult your physician before starting an exercise program and consult their physician before becoming sedentary. Yes. It's a little bit like that as well. Right. So anyway, well, hey, this was a really fun conversation. Thank you, Greg, for being part of the show. Really appreciate it. And thanks for all the work you do with Matter. It's just, man, need more voices like yours and need more gatherings like yours. So really appreciate it. Thank you, Lance, for the time as always. Thanks to Lucian in Montana for making us sound good and look good, or at least sound and look as good as we can. Thanks for listening, all of you. Appreciate it. We'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Engaging Culture.
Thank you for listening to Engaging Culture, a podcast by Bridgeway Christian Church. If you enjoyed this show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. Music is used under the Creative Commons license and is provided by Dexter Britton.